Hi everyone, and welcome to this latest episode of Supply Chain Talk. My name is Duncan Brock. I'm a director at the Chartered Institute of Procurement and Supply, or CIPS. Delighted, as usual, to have the opportunity to host today's discussion. Every week we choose a different topic, and this week's no different, of a very specific topic looking at supply chain network design technology and how to really apply it in today's very uncertain times that we're all facing. So it's really good to be here. And last week, we had a great discussion talking about supporting suppliers on net zero and sustainability. So really focusing on that element of supply chain, whereas this time looking a lot more at that network design, technology and approaches around that. So it's going to be really good to hear from the three experts we've got. As usual, they're coming from different backgrounds, bringing some real experience and interest and insights about how to go about really designing these supply chains differently and applying the technology in a certain way. So really looking forward to that discussion with them. Those of you who joined us before on Supply Chain Talk will know that we have the ability to do chat and Q&A. So certainly in the chat, please do say hello. Good afternoon again to you, Mark. I think you're normally the first one to join us. So well done for that. And thank you again for joining us on Supply Chain Talk. So please do put your comments in chat, thoughts you've got around the topic and so on. It's always good to see. And often we get a nice thread running in terms of people chatting amongst themselves as we're talking. I'd also encourage you to do any questions you've got and feed those through to us as well. So anything you can put into the Q&A, I'll make sure that I try and bring that to life and ask our guests those specific questions as we go through. So I really look forward to involving you in this and making sure it really comes to life for you in the right way. As you also know, we also cover a sort of broader macro news article, and this week's no different. We've got a really good article we're going to sort of discuss, which hopefully will bring some insight into. So really good to see you all. And Nigel, welcome to you. Great to have you back again. So this week, as I said, it's all about sort of supply chain design. One thing I forgot. We do have an incentive for you all, this wonderful high quality Supply Chain Talk mug for that person who asks the best question or adds the best comment as you go through. So I will be keeping an eye on that and make sure that at the end of the session, we do get a chance to award that mug to one of you. So let me kick off. Let me bring our first guest in. Our first guest is Liam Costello. He's the Global Supply Chain Logistics Capability Manager at Intel. So I think you're based out in Dublin, Liam, is that right?
Yeah, correct, Duncan, yeah.
Okay, so welcome to you.
Thank you.
I gave you a job title, maybe a little bit about your role and what you do at Intel.
Yeah, sure. So basically I look after all of our logistics systems and capabilities. So everything from, how we might evolve our warehouse management systems to transportation management systems, but also look at how we bring on new business, mergers and acquisitions, new site startups, developing the logistics systems capabilities associated with that and linking in with our overall supply chain and making sure everything is kind of working in tandem. So it's very global in nature, based in Dublin, but it's quite suited to work from home with the global nature of our business.
Okay, and probably long days and associated with the time zones you must operate.
Funny hours, yeah.
Funny hours, yeah. So, great you joined us, and thanks for that, Liam. And actually, the article that we're going to focus on today, I suppose, really just plays to exactly what you described as your background there, because the article we were picked up was in CNBC, an article sort of 2 or 3 weeks ago now, and it was about Intel, and it was about this sort of commitment to investing 36 billion to making chips in Europe. And I think as I read through the article, and I know it's on screen now and the links in the chat, but actually, this is all about major investments, not just in a factory in Germany, but into an R&D and design hub in France. There's investments in Ireland and Italy and Poland and Spain. Significant shift, I think, for Intel in terms of significant investment in Europe, but also spread across a number of countries. So obviously there's some sort of incentives or political elements there, as well as obviously a major support for the supply bit going forward. So, I mean, Leon, I'd be very interested, specifically with you working for Intel, to get your take on this and maybe some of the thoughts that go in behind this sort of investment that Intel are making.
Yeah, it's really exciting times. It's colossal investment, And this coupled with, back in January, they announced about a $20 billion investment in Ohio in the US. And so that announcement for Ohio and coupled with the one in Germany, they're the first greenfield sites Intel is going to break ground on for maybe 30 years. So, that is in itself a signal of intent. And so how did it come about is, a number of factors. COVID definitely did play some part in it. You all see, okay, that putting all your eggs in one basket, or centralization of functions does have its merits, but also we've seen from a global supply chain perspective that has come unstuck to a certain extent in the past couple of years with that. We also had a new CEO come on board last year, about 14 months ago or so, and he came out with his intent that, hey, manufacturing is a real core competency of Intel, and he wants to double down that by making chips for others. And this it was a perfect storm to a certain extent, in that the demand for semiconductor chips has never been stronger. Particularly Europe, we've seen in the headlines, the production line stoppages in some of the automotive makers, that they basically can't get semiconductors. So Intel then decided, okay, look, we recognize that Taiwan in particular, but the whole Asia region is accounting for over 80% now of semiconductor manufacturing. It was the other way around. It was 80% between the US and EMEA back 30 years ago, almost 50% in Europe alone. So that has shifted due to underinvestment um, to a huge extent. So this is sort of a bringing all that together and say, okay, look, we're putting our money where our mouth is, and we're going to set up manufacturing in Europe, really grow the existing base we have, and also set up a new greenfield site in Germany. And also, this is something our customers want. When we look at, say, our customers, that, when we are saying, okay, we're going into the business of making semiconductors for other customers, they like having that proximity, that we'll have end-to-end from design through to wafer manufacturing to advanced back-end assembly in Italy. We'll have more or less that end-to-end solution here available for them in EMEA. So, there are incentives from the European Union to, grow that semiconductor industry, to develop that ecosystem here. And so it's capitalizing that, but also diversification of Intel's supply chain.
I mean, thanks for that explanation, Liam. But I think the scale of investments. I mean, you just said $20 billion there in the US, 36 billion in Europe. I mean, that's over $50 billion investment, and it's not going to come on stream, presumably 2027 or something by the time you get into manufacturing. So it really is a long strategic play for Intel, isn't it?
It is. I suppose one of the things, maybe one of the things that why that investment in Europe hasn't happened last number of years, the cost to play the game now has just grown exponentially.
Right.
Maybe 10, 15 years ago, you could build, leading edge wafer fab facility for maybe 3 billion. But now you might only build the structure for 3 billion. To equip it, you're talking about the other 15. So the level of complexity to play, particularly at the leading edge of that, is just grown hugely. And that's why, from a European perspective, it's great to have this now in Europe, give Europe that independent supply, that you can get your leading edge manufacturing made here. Up to now, it's only really been the leading edge manufacturing has only been in Asia. Now we're going to see it come on stream in Ireland, and ultimately in Germany by 2027.
And if you look at I mean, you said the customers are looking for it. I mean, you must also have confidence that there is a strong or growing demand for semiconductors. I mean, obviously, IT sector particularly is growing dramatically. You talked about automotive, but the drive for electrification of cars and vehicles generally. Surely, I mean, I assume that's part of what's driving that sort of. The growth's going to be there, and therefore you can make these investments.
Yeah, absolutely. And when we see the demand that we have, before you go to walk around in our warehouse, you see shelves just jam packed. You go walk around our warehouse now, you see empty pallet racking, right? Because we're just cleaned out. Everything we can make is more or less been sold. But it's as we then grow into the leading edge manufacturing for other customers, that then opens up new markets to us. And so in those conversations with those customers, the big cloud service providers, but also the automotive makers, everyone that's a lot of fabulous type of companies where they're basically designing their semiconductors, but they don't have the manufacturing footprint because it just costs too much to develop that. We're making that available to these customers now.
And I mean, you say, but it's also a competitive market. So I suppose it's also that sort of sense of how does Intel differentiate itself, and how do you sort of prove that actually you've got that, I suppose, local capability and local design capability, as well as, you know, high quality manufacturing base as well.
Yeah, absolutely. You have to provide the end-to-end solution. You know, enable the customers to bring on their designs. You work with them at the early stage to bring a semiconductor design from a design stage through to, you know, your first components coming out. You're talking over 2 years. You know, so it's even the design cycle for these is long. So, you know, customers are planning ahead. You know, the manufacturing to put that footprint in place, that takes a long time. So you have to, you know, put that investment in place up front to give customers the confidence. Okay, if I'm going to go with Intel and design my chips and their processes, I want to know that they're here for the long haul. So you have to put that investment in place.
Yeah. And I've just seen a comment in from Nigel Strutt, which is sort of something I was going to touch on. Nigel sort of says, would you comment on, I suppose, the balance of security of supply for customers versus lowest cost? Ultimately, that's a real balancing act, I think, for you supplying into those markets as well.
Yeah, even with, you know, the advanced semiconductor manufacturing factories now, you know, okay, labor is one element, but it's not huge. You know, if you talk about 18 billion to build a factory, you know, these factories are fully automated.
Right.
So the labor that goes in is purely on the engineering and maintenance side. So it is a factor, but security of supply, you know, cost may have been 2 years ago, but what we've seen with COVID, security of supply, and this move from maybe just in time to just in case, this type of model, you know, that has, we've seen that fundamental shift in supply chains the last number of years.
Yeah, and as you said, you know, automotive factories not running. I mean, the cost all the way through the supply chains, that has been huge, hasn't it? And the significant impact, not just for the automotive companies, but their supply chains as well. So, you know, giving them confidence that they can build as they plan to build, and the supply chains can run smoothly. That, you know, that for them is essential, isn't it?
Yeah, it is. And, you know, maybe the automotive won't be made on the leading edge type nodes, but Intel has committed also as part is to keep maybe our trailing nodes, the ones we may mothball previously and refit the factories. We're going to keep them up and running now to provide that security supply for those type of automotive components that aren't on the leading edge. So you have to provide that security of supply to customers, and then having that end-to-end capability within Europe. So with the advanced assembly plant that will be announced for Italy at some stage, and also with the Intel acquisition of Tower Semiconductor, you know, that is sort of, you know, giving that security of supply to these customers. We have the end-to-end type solution.
That's great. Thanks, Liam. And thanks for those sort of insights as well. It's really good to actually hear the real sort of, you know, we can all read the stories, but it's great that you sort of gave that as insights. Let me bring the our other couple of guests on in now, if I can. So we've got two other guests joining us. We've got David McKenzie, who's the Senior Manager at Baringa Partners. So welcome to you, David. And we've also got Paul van Nierop, who is the Product Owner, Supply Chain Network Design at Ames. So welcome to the two of you. I've read out your job title, so maybe a quick intro to both of you. David, for you first.
Yeah, so good afternoon, everybody. So David McKenzie, part of Baringa Partners, work within our supply chain practice. My background, very much supply chain logistics, lived and breathed network design, implementing it and using it in practice and in earnest. And you know, more recently, kind of within Baringa, kind of working with clients on some of these sort of challenges that we see around uncertainty, and you know, with COVID and Brexit and other sorts of big geopolitical events obviously going on at the moment. You know, these are big supply chain challenges, and a lot of our clients are obviously kind of looking for help in that. So yeah, hugely interesting topic and one close to my heart.
And the clients keeping you busy.
Yes,
good,
100%.
Okay, and Paul, intro to you.
Hi, good afternoon, Duncan, and good afternoon, everybody. My name is Paul van Nierop. I'm the product owner at Ames for the network design applications that we build. So we're a technology software provider, and we build the technology that helps address these supply chain design questions that we'll talk about. So I've been with Ames for about 5 years. I work on the product side, looking after the roadmap, but also extensively with customers, and of course we're very proud to work with Intel as well. But I've spent probably the last 20 years also in supply chain network design and working with the different technologies that support that.
That's
Very
great.
pleased to be here today.
Yeah, thank you, Paul. And yeah, we'll get into much more specifics around this in a few minutes. But Liam's just done a great job there of talking about this sort of broader, Intel's goals, their objectives, what they're doing, what the investments they're making in Europe, and the reasons why. I'm interested in both David and Paul, your views on this, because this is quite a significant change, I suppose, in a supply chain, in the way that they're going to supply their customers and the investments they're making. And I suppose it's very interesting just to sort of reflect on that. And I'd be interested in both your views on both Intel's view, but also maybe others who are doing something similar. So, David, maybe you kick off.
Yeah, and I think it's a trend that we're starting to see a little bit more, and it's very much kind of getting into the C-suite conversations actually across all industries, actually not just in the case of Intel, but historically when we sort of looked at network design, and when I've been looked at network design in my past, it's very much a cost and service type of equation, and all of a sudden now with all of the sort of recent events, resilience and kind of how do you design your supply chain with risk in mind, and taking that into account, alongside now also things like sustainability, which is obviously a huge bearing on this in terms of where you're locating your warehouses and your manufacturing plants in relation to your markets. All of those sort of big decisions are really starting to come to the fore, and I think examples like COVID, where there's challenges of labour shortages and other pieces like that, all compound into big decisions that need to be made, and and obviously the sort of the Intel decision to move into Europe is a trend that I think is probably going to continue as we start to see more localization really of the supply chains.
But on there's still quite a few organizations still waiting. I mean, Intel have announced this as being a big strategic sort of long-term thing, but certainly, talking to a lot of organizations, they're still, let's just see how things pan out and then we'll make that big call. Whereas actually it's interesting that Intel are making that call now, or have made that call over the last sort of 6 months or so. It's a different dynamic there, isn't it?
Yeah, and I mean, there was an interesting report from McKinsey actually that recently sort of said that sort of 40% of executives now are genuinely looking at strategies of nearshoring. So it's on the agenda. People are looking at it, but I don't think there's a huge number of examples where businesses are making big, multi-billion-pound decisions to start bringing things through. But that's where sort of the decision making, and obviously the topic of today's session is really about is how best to make those decisions and when to make those decisions in particular. Yeah,
absolutely. And Paul, your thoughts?
Yeah, to be sure. So we also see it from our customer base. This pull towards network design and digitalizing the supply chain at a strategic level, and with creating this ability to do these kind of studies more and more regularly. So I think what we're seeing a lot is the move towards firstly establishing a competency in-house. So network design was often an exercise done once every 2 to 5 years. What we see more and more from our clients is this need to in-house that competence and make it part of the normal supply chain planning function rather than a once-off project. So definitely that's the kind of use cases that we're talking about. We're seeing so the de-risking of the supply chain is pretty key. We see customers doing the exercise about nearshoring and bringing back production, and I think the Intel example is also a clear case of that. But we also see customers doing the opposite in some cases. So establishing production in Asia, for example, to boost the resilience of the supply chains in Asia. So I think there's a lot of different there's a lot of different things happening, and it's also not just big strategic questions anymore, right? I think the Intel example is a clear-cut case of this is a strategic decision for the long term. But what we see with the world changing so quickly, there's design elements that become more and more tactical. So the ability to revise how you set up your supply chain and flow product through it, you can actually make smaller changes on a more regular basis. So if a DC closes down because everybody's sick because of COVID, you can actually run a what-if scenario off your models and your digital twins to say, well, what's the impact of that, and what's Plan B for the next 6 to 12 months. I think there's also this trend towards not only long-term massive decisions, but shorter-term, more tactical decisions that you can make.
Yeah, and I'd be interesting. I mean, bringing you back in as well, Liam. I mean, you described you've made your decision, and obviously the investments there, but actually just looking at the complexity of the what do you put where? Which countries do you go to, and where's the capability, and what, back to Paul's point about that sort of the resilience of it and the support there. I mean, there must be quite a long strategic planning discussion within Intel before you get to that point.
It is, and there's multiple factors go into it, and where supply chain, previously would not have been a major input into it, but I've seen since COVID, it has become a major factor into that. Our product designs, they're changing, as in there's, you buy a semiconductor component now, there's no longer just one piece of silicon in it, there's multiple pieces of silicon in that. So as you bring all those together, then you maybe realize, hang on, this might make business sense to do this as well, right? As you bring all these different parts together, the cost of, inventory you may need to carry, by shipping everything to an Asia location, that may well outweigh the cost of, higher cost of, maybe labor in one area by having a more consolidated end-to-end manufacturing footprint. So that's one of the factors we've seen in terms of, the need for having more localization, having that end-to-end manufacturing together.
It's maybe just to build on that a little bit. So I think it's important also to mention the multiple objectives that David touched on earlier, right? So in the old days, let's call it a few years ago, when it was all about cost, it was fairly straightforward, right? It's minimize cost, but the things that David mentioned, it's about service levels. And in the beginning, that was all about the last mile. How soon can I reach my customer? But what we're seeing also in the Intel case is that you don't need to just look at the last mile. You need to look at the end-to-end lead time. So all the way from supplier through DC through the distribution. So that's a different kind of objective. And then there's the risk aspect. So David, we've spoken in the past a little bit about using risk indexes in the multi-objective optimization to say, all right, how do I design for minimum risk? What does that do to my cost? And you can do that with other things like sustainability as well. So the carbon issue, what we hear from our customers is supply chain, how you design your supply chain impacts how much carbon you emit. So it needs to be part of the objective. So I think this concept of not just looking at minimum cost anymore, but trading off multiple objectives in your network design is becoming pretty key. And it's all about trade-offs. So it's not just the minimum carbon network, because that puts you out of business from a financial point of view. It's the designing the network that gives you a big hit on the carbon, big reduction for a small increase in cost. It's finding those trade-offs, those balances.
Yeah, and there isn't a one-size-fits-all, is there? I mean, I think that's often the case. People will say, well, what's the answer? And I think what you just described is you need to take all those factors into account. And it's interesting, I think just commenting from Nigel Strutt here, another one from Nigel, he says something about how affordable is just in case, or is it a buzzword until we see a more stable world, and whether it's a lowest cost wins environment. So I think it's back to this piece of, is this more of a, I think you used the point, Liam, your warehouses are empty at the moment, but you want to get back to building those warehouses back up again because people want that resilience. Do you see it going back to low cost, or do you think that really this is quite a significant systemic shift in how people run their supply chains?
Yeah, I think, having diversification, in my eyes anyway, it allows you to respond to demand better. So by Intel having, say, manufacturing of a particular component, maybe spread across, whereas before we might have it solely in one location, now we may have it in two locations. It allows you to respond to demand better. Okay, the cycle time for semiconductors is pretty long, but you can do certain things in line to respond to that demand changes. So understanding your demand patterns, how that feeds in, and being able to respond quickly. So having both the wafer manufacturing and the back end assembly close together, it allows you to respond much faster than, say, if one was in Asia, versus the other. So you're adding 3-4 days to your cycle time, whereas you can have it overnight, maybe from Germany to Italy.
Right.
And I think to build on that, I think the agreed right now the sort of the just in case sort of building up inventory levels is obviously is commonplace, and interestingly, actually, a lot of the sort of discussions that we have is a lot of the businesses that have fared okay over this last couple of years actually have done so because they have high inventories actually, and that's by accident created a bit of a buffer in their supply chain. But strategies, postponement strategies and those types of things where, deferring the decision making on assembly and manufacturing and trying to get, product closer to the point of demand are all sort of activities now that are very much, front and center of mind really in terms of the way that those supply chains are designed, in order to try and mitigate some of that additional inventory cost. But inevitably, I think with greater uncertainty comes, the inventory becomes a very natural response to that, and therefore probably will suggest that we'll move to a more just in case model for at least for the midterm, I would have said.
Yeah, and customers are willing to pay for that as well. They're willing to pay for a certain amount of that just in case. You mentioned the postponement bit there, David. You can bring semiconductors up to a certain point in the flow and park them there, and then leave the last bit of configuration and build out to the last possible moment. So customers are willing to pay for that. So they see that the value themselves in paying for service with to meet their demands.
Yeah, then I think Nigel's also pointed about when it will become a more stable world. I think if any of us can predict that, with what's sort of recently happened with Russia and Ukraine, on top of where we're at with COVID and where we're at with Brexit before that, and any other shocks we've had through the systems. I mean, yeah, I think I've heard lots of people talk about the fact that, this is just another shock, but there will always be shocks to the system, and the more end-to-end supply chains are exposed to those shocks, the more vulnerable we are, and therefore there's a lot more. I mean, I think Liam, you said earlier, maybe the supply chain weren't brought into these strategic discussions in the past, but now they are, because people understand that you can't just make a call on something. You've got to make sure your supply chains are really in the right place to support that as well.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's interesting that discussion is now happening in the boardroom rather than in the supply chain manager's office, because I mean there's a cost to just in case, I think, in terms of inventory, but there's also a cost if you're not able to respond to the disruptions that we keep hearing are going to happen more and more frequently and more regularly. So I think the conversations are now driven from a different space than they used to be as well, and I think that's important.
Yeah, and maybe the finance community also maybe using some different, and the investor community using some different metrics when they measure success as well, because that's changed, hasn't it? So let's sort of move on, if I may, into sort of a few more specifics around supply chain network design technology, because I think that there's a couple of specific areas I want to drop into there. But before I do, I've trotted out this word a few times now. It's supply chain network design technology. Paul, what are we talking about here?
Yeah, it's a good question, and there's a few definitions. So David will help me if I get it wrong. But in my mind, it boils down to an approach to designing your supply chain. And if you talk about design, it means two key things. It means footprint. So where do I establish my manufacturing facilities? The example we've just spoken about. Where do I position my suppliers? Where do I buy from? Where do I have my DCs? How many do I have? Are they in the right places or in the wrong places? Have I got too many, too few? So it's about where I buy and make my goods and where I store my goods in warehouses. And then it's the flow question. So how do I flow product from supplier all the way through to demand? Which mode of transport do I use? Which customers do I allocate to which service location, etc.? So it's really those two key points of footprint and optimized flow. And how you do that is you need technology to support that, because supply chains are extremely complex. There's so many unknowns and so many variables. So the technology that supports that is typically a digital twin kind of representation of your supply chain, but at the strategic level, not at a very granular level. And you use optimization technology. So it's mathematical optimization. It's a subsection of artificial intelligence, not machine learning, but more the prescriptive analytics part of that scope. So these mathematical optimization engines give you a recommended action. So they say, this is how my supply chain looks. This is the crisis that's happened. Let me model it off my digital twin, hit the optimize button, and it comes back with a recommended action and says, this is the optimal way to meet this future that you're trying to simulate. So that's in a nutshell how I would define supply chain network design.
That's definitely helped. So thank you for that, Paul. David, was he right? I mean, he did say correct him if he was wrong. So I'm assuming
I wouldn't dare build on that. No.
But I mean, you talked about this digital twin, but also I think you touched a bit earlier about the fact that you need to run these things regularly. So whereas before, I think you described it that maybe you do it once and that will set your strategy, and then you go and implement that strategy. But I mean, you talk. I think you're talking here about it being also part of the rolling, I suppose, development, design, and management of the supply chain. Is that right?
Yeah, I think the point is that it's always on hand. So it's you're not redesigning every 5 seconds. So the concept of continuous planning happens at a more operational level, where you're continuously adjusting at the order level, at the order line and the truck line. But from a strategic, tactical point of view, you need a digital twin that's always available. So it needs to be refreshed fairly regularly, not every 5 seconds, but once every month, once every quarter at least, I would say. So that when you need to run a scenario, that the base work has been done and that digital representation is at hand, that you can run the what if scenarios. And what's really nice then is once you've got that, there's no limit to the number of scenarios that you can run, because a lot of design is about it's about a future that's not there yet, right? So you don't really know what's going to happen. So what it boils down to in the end is running these multiple what if scenarios, and sometimes hundreds. So if you say, well, I'm not sure if there's going to be an incident at the DC because there's a hurricane, let me run multiple scenarios. Let me shut it down, see what happens. Let me leave it open. Let me drop it to 50% capacity. So this ability to run these multiple what if scenarios, I think, is the secret sauce there.
And there are lots of companies running this. I mean, maybe bring yourself in, David. I mean, you say the more companies are looking to do this. I mean, to building that digital twin in the first place, to get everything in place to then be able to run the scenarios. I mean, I'm assuming that's quite a significant step they need to take first before they can start to run the scenarios.
Yeah, and that kind of that capability and that competency within the business, and it is something that, yes, a lot of the clients we work with are trying to shape and build. And I think Paul's point is spot on, which is historically network design has been this very complicated big project thing that gets done once in a blue moon, put in the top drawer of a desk, and once the decision's made and never used again. And that trend is now changing, really, where actually it's starting, almost there's a need now to start bringing that into a more not to the extent of full execution, but very much decision making on a more active basis, and starting to try those what if scenarios around. We've got a plant that perhaps is struggling because of COVID, and we need to reroute product around that plant, or conversely, going into the supply chain, there could be we've got a certain supplier or a certain route that seems like it's higher risk now. What would happen if something happened there, and therefore what does our supply chain need to do to respond? So starting to bring that kind of network design technology in the digital twin space into much more of a kind of an operational execution space, but not right down to the day allocation stuff. That's very much where the sort of the digital twin starting to play. And spot on, you need that competency and that capability, and almost that kind of that center of excellence within the business to pull that information in. And the quality of the data and the systems and how you access that is obviously a big component of that sort of journey and kind of competency build. But definitely something that is a developing trend that we're seeing across lots of clients.
Yeah, and I suppose as well, on top of that, you might set out your network design, your model of a particular product or something like that. And we would have done this ourselves years ago, that you'd set that in place and you just lock and load and off you go. But now, if you look at the last couple of years, you've seen COVID, you've seen freight rates grow exponentially, So, some of the decisions you may have made back then, they're no longer valid. Right. So some of that nearshoring, for example, may be well justified, but also what you may have optimized from a network a number of years ago, that's no longer the case. It's no longer optimal. Yeah, so you have to be looking at even customer demand. We've seen a lot of customer demand shift due to geopolitical stuff that's been going on the past 3-4 years, with the US-China trade war, and a lot of they're trying to make some of their changes, we're picking up on the tail end. We see it in our demand, so you have to be reloading those demand patterns into your models.
I mean, I understand the element of sort of the supply chain. I suppose the other sort of point here is how do you build those other factors in? So you talk about carbon or sustainability or those other sort of, the world is changing around us. What our investors are looking for is changing. What customers are looking for is changing. So are you able to build all those other sort of, I suppose, intangible variables into these models, as well as the more sort of, I can see how this supply chain is going to flow, but how do you add those other factors in as well?
Sorry, Liam, please go ahead.
No, go ahead, Paul.
Well, I think the technology needs to be able to support that, right? And I think that's why we're seeing a lot of activity in the multi-objective space. So dollars and euros are pretty easy to quantify, and I think to some extent carbon tons are easy to quantify, although it depends on which source of data you use to support that. So already you're getting into a space where some of the data that supports it is becoming a little bit more fuzzy. And if you start looking at risk factors, you can start thinking about things like risk indexes. So to put some kind of quantitative measure on a risk or a resilience factor. So, and with multi-objective technology, you can do that. But I think it's the more fuzzy the objective becomes, the harder it is to put an exact number on it. And I think that's where some of the skill of how you do this and what kind of assumptions you make comes into it. So I think from a technology point of view, you need to be able to cater for multiple objectives, but you also need the skills on the side of the organizations that are using the technology to come up with credible metrics to measure that kind of thing. And I think there's different ways to do that, right? You can take the carbon example. If you want to say, well, I'm counting I'm optimizing the dollars and the euros, and now I add carbon into that mix, I can take a call on carbon pricing. I can say a ton of carbon emitted is worth $30. But if you read up on it, you could pick a number anywhere between $30 and $200 per ton of carbon. So you need to make some judgment about how you weight these different objectives in relation to each other, and that could be different for different organizations.
Yeah, I don't think it's a one size fits all either, right? So we're looking at this maybe on a product by product basis. So what's important for each product? Is it service or is it cost? So for the products that service is more important, we may optimize those for hey, let's spend whatever we need to on freight here. Let's move this really fast, because we might have a high margin or whatever that may be on that product. But some of the lower value type products, we say no. Look, let's just look for the most cost-effective supply chain here. So you're looking at what it's enabled us to do anyway, is to look at this on an individual product by product basis.
And I think Liam as well. I'm not sure whether Intel are doing this, but particularly in pharmaceuticals is a good example actually, where the decision making on product design and the supply chain design that underpins that product from a risk perspective is now is starting to become part of that decision making process. So if there are ingredients or there's parts that are from a particularly risky part of the supply chain, and actually where you source that from and how you design that supply chain to support that product, that sort of decision making is suddenly becoming, the supply chain kind of managers of the world are actually starting to get into those conversations much earlier than I think than you used to. Often, I came from a world where supply chain was almost the afterthought of down the line, and you would almost pick up the pieces of a product design decision, and that's very much now kind of the more we can bring that sort of decision making for supply chain upstream into product design and thinking about resilience and risk, I think is a really key part.
Yeah, I almost liken it to moving your network design from a join the dots exercise where you got handed, okay, you go live with this, go figure it out. You're no ability to influence. Where now you're moving up, people recognize the value of what supply chain can bring, and you move that back up the product development cycle, and now you're playing at the design stage, and the value of that, and then having to build a model quickly with that is critical. So if they're coming to you with, hey, can you run this scenario? What do you think? And if it takes you 6 weeks to come back with an answer, then well, that's not much good. They're not going to come to you again. Yeah. Whereas if you better go back within a day or two, that's what they want.
Yeah.
And that's interesting. And there's a question in from Fabrizio Figuero. So welcome to you, Fabrizio. He says, what are the best strategies and scenarios to model scarcity and inflation factors within the supply chain? So I use the example of oil prices. And I think back to your point, Liam, oil prices is running at $50 and suddenly it's $130, and therefore what's the impact on that? And then determine your sourcing strategy. So I think he's probably asking a similar questions that you're answering, which is, how do you do this? What are the scenarios you run to make sure that you've got that scarcity, inflation, sourcing strategies all put together? I mean, what's the best way of doing that?
Yeah, again, I think it's you have to look at this on a case by case basis. Even a lot of the capital equipment that we would source, a lot of it would come from Asia, and now you try and put that on an ocean liner to go trans-Pacific. Pick a number between 1 and 365, you don't know when it's going to get there.
Yeah.
So now we say, hang on, our factory cannot start up. So are you going to wait an $18 billion factory waiting for that cargo ship to dock? Are you going to spend maybe a sum of money on air freight and that? Right. So everything has to be looked at. What we're seeing more and more is that the one size fits all no longer works. Everything is on a case by case basis. So yeah, it's a valid question, but there's no simple answer, I would say, either.
Yeah, and I would maybe just add to that. I think you're quite right, Liam. So it's a case by case basis, and you don't always know what the case is going to be. So this ability to model the scenarios, I think, is exactly that. So if you look at the question specifically, so if you're modeling scarcity, you've got the ability to constrain these models. You can say, well, I would love to get all my supply out of factory A, but I could only get 100,000 units. So that becomes a capacity constraint. So you can model it, and with inflation, again, you don't really know what it's going to look like, but you can model 3 scenarios where you think, well, this is my high scenario on oil price, this is my expected scenario, and this is my low case scenario. So let's run that through the system and see what the 3 different scenarios tell me, and then maybe come up with a solution that allows you to cater for all 3 scenarios ahead of time. So I think it's a case by case basis, as Liam said. It's the ability to run multiple scenarios, and it's the ability to constrain it, and capture all those complexities on different prices that may happen.
Yeah. And having those conversations with your stakeholders as well. Understand, okay, well, what's important to you? Are you willing to pay? So talk to our manufacturing startup folks. Are they willing to pay to air freight that versus wait from an ocean liner? So understanding their supply chain and their needs, and so again, feeding that into the supply chain model, understanding the demand pattern, that's really important.
Yeah, and I think the risk of going slightly off topic of the chat, the other thing is also how you use network design technology in complement to some of the other technologies. So almost in the kind of the integrated business planning space, and when you're looking at your demand and supply plans and trying to work through the sourcing strategies and what you need to buy from where and at what points, all of that can be done in context with the network design and looking at those kind of vulnerabilities and opportunities within that. And you can create this is the beauty of these digital tools, is that you can create so many different scenarios and put likelihoods across that, so that you end up with a balanced view of this is the best cost, but also kind of risk-based decision that we can make in the supply chain, and that's the power of these tools, really, that differentiate them from the Excel-based tools and anything else that clients and companies are often using.
And there's one other question which I think sort of builds on that as well, David, which is, and back to your point, Liam, about stakeholders here. So finance are a key stakeholder here. So how do you build that conversation with finance around, I've done this modeling, I've run these scenarios, how do you then work with them on the financial implications of the margins, the investments, the cash flow, the balance sheets, all those aspects that need to be built into this to make the right decision?
Yeah, it's having the ability to run the models, and then you can take the data from that, summarize the data, and say, okay, look, these are your options. This is what the risk of each one of these is. This is what the cost of each of these is, and let them make the decision.
Right.
So,
but at least you got the models there in front of them with the
exactly.
Rather than just I've come up with a great solution. Here you go. Is this all right or not?
Yeah. Obviously, we'll bring a recommendation with that. We're trying to understand up front what their priority is from a business. Having that allows us to, okay, we can optimize for this, and the different factors that we'll put into the model to spit out the different scenarios, that'll be based on that. But ultimately, it comes down to some trade-offs. You can't optimize for everything, as Paul was saying. You have to be able to optimize, what's important for the business, and that it has to be looked at on a case-by-case basis.
I mean, most colleagues in finance that I've ever come across in my career have absolutely loved these types of tools, in truth, because actually it's a way of really making informed decisions, which often, if you don't have the data, if you don't have the scenarios to compare and contrast, it's really difficult to make the decision. And if you're making a 30 billion pound plus decision, obviously that Intel have made, to do that without really clear scenario modeling and understanding that is incredibly difficult for finance, actually. So I think often I see there's a really good response through the finance community to this, but it doesn't change the message is the same, which is if there are difficult decisions to make that perhaps increase the finance costs of the supply chain, because that's that the view is that that's the right option, then those are the difficult conversations naturally. But this technology, I think, allows you to make smarter and better decisions and informed decisions ultimately.
Yeah, and it brings certainty. If you have that data and you bring it and you present it to finance, they can build that into the cost model at the design stage, versus we hit production and I go, oh, by the way, this is costing 20% more. That's not the time to come with that.
Yeah. And I think that probably also comes to one of the other points I think that Nigel's brought it because you've got the scenarios and the variables. And I think, David, your point there is, but you need the data. And to get the data, you need to engage the whole business on this. This isn't, you sat there with a spreadsheet trying to estimate a few numbers. I mean, clearly you're going to have to gather the information, gather the data from, and involve the whole business in this to make the right decision. And therefore, it probably feels a lot more inclusive, doesn't it? That actually it is a business decision, but everyone's involved because they're providing the inputs and then they're sort of reviewing the scenarios. It feels much more joined up in a way that maybe we haven't seen before.
We've got a visitor.
Sorry.
We've got a new guest, Duncan.
Yeah.
Yeah, but you're quite right? So the conversations have changed. Also, I've seen a lot. So it's no longer a case of a network modeler coming to the supply chain director and saying, "Hey, I've got a great idea. How do you feel?" So we're seeing the conversations happening with executives now, and people getting excited about it because they see the potential and they can get involved in the discussion. And you'll be surprised how quickly people move into the mode of saying, "Oh, that's interesting. Can you try that? Can you test that?
Yeah.
Can we see what happens if this happens?" So it's definitely the conversations changed. It's not just a supply chain conversation anymore. So that's nice to see.
So maybe one final. How long does it take to build one of these? You talk about building the supply chain model, and then sort of building it and getting it into the technology, and then starting to run the scenarios. I mean, if I was doing nothing and I wanted to get to a point where I was able to do this, how long would it take me?
Yeah, it's a great question, and it's a little bit. It depends. And unfortunately, that's the answer. It depends on the complexity of the supply chain, and it depends a lot on the data. So you need data to feed the models, and depending on how quickly you can get that out of an organization and how clean it is, that's got a big impact. And then certainly the complexity of the problem that you're trying to solve. So I would say anywhere between 2 weeks and 6 months. And on average, 3 months before you've got a model that's up and running, you can start running some scenarios. I think it's worth adding, though, that it's also layers of the onion, right? So you don't need to model everything in the highest level of detail straight away. You can start with a simple model, get some directional insights from it, and then start adding to that model and sharpening up the data and expanding it to different geographies, different product groups, etc. So that would be my take on it, David. But you got a lot of experience here as well. What's your take?
Yeah, I think the analogy of the onion is a very good one. Actually, it's often it's keeping the sort of the model and the use cases quite specific in the short term, and then developing up from that and developing the complexity as you need to. Obviously, digital twin is a very different need to, say, a project. Doing a one-off project for network design. Can typically be done a bit quicker. Whereas to define and design your digital twin, you want to have the right data. You want to have that feeding into the tool on an active basis. You want to have the competencies in the business to be able to run it ongoing. That's obviously a much more involved piece that clearly is probably at the back end of Paul's point on sort of 6 months plus. But yes, it's very much a how long is a piece of string and how complex is the question. But what I do find and what I think is very powerful is that often in a very quick, short time frame, you can get to an 80 or a 90% answer that really starts to direct you in the right channels to where you need to be focusing and where to then put the energy behind what's the detailed model. So there's definitely value in kind of getting on that and iterating quickly.
Right.
Yeah, I think you mentioned there, David, iterating. So you can build the basic model, but the alternative, you do this in Excel. So you do it in Excel. It takes maybe 6 weeks, 8 weeks to build a model, and then once you're finished that single analysis based on one scenario, you throw it out. You have to start every time again. So you're never building on your knowledge. Whereas what we find is, okay, we started small, build up, and you're constantly iterating, evolving.
Right. No, that's great. Thank you. Guys, we're out of time. It's been a fascinating discussion. It's been really good, some great engagement from the audience as well. But I mean, I've learned a lot. One of the things I love about hosting these sessions is I'm able to sit and actually talk to experts and get some insights about all the aspects of supply chain. So David, Paul, Liam, it's been a great discussion today. I really enjoyed it. Thanks to the audience for also participating. We've had some great comments and questions and thoughts. I think Fabrizio's was a great question, but I think Nigel Strutt, I think we need to get the mug to you, because I think you started very early with some questions and comments, and you came in at the end there as well. So Nigel, congratulations to you, and I hope you enjoy your mug. I look forward to you using it next time I see you on a screen. So I look forward to that bit. So we've come to the end of this session of Supply Chain Talk. The next week we're talking about the challenge of contraction. So responding to COVID and Brexit. We've got a couple of great guests, and one of my colleagues is hosting that for me. So really looking forward to that discussion. So please join us for that. And participate and enjoy the session. But Paul, Liam, David, thanks very much for your time today. Really enjoyed the discussion. It's been a great discussion. So thank you.
Thank you, Duncan. Cheers, everyone.